So I want to talk to you about voting. We think voting is pretty important, and it has a particular resonance for me. When I was 19 years old, I went to martial law Poland. I was doing some work with the Solidarity trade movement. And what I saw there was that if you were caught with a flyer endorsing a trade union, you could go to jail. You could not stand up and say, I don't like the way this country's being run, because you could go to jail. But it was not only that you had no freedom, but people didn't have enough food. If they wanted to get some kind of meat, they had coupons, they had rations. They didn't have housing. You had 4 generations of people living in tiny apartments. Life was miserable. And after a couple of weeks and seeing how horrible things were, I started asking folks, if you could have one thing, what would it be? And I expected them to say, I want a nice apartment. I want a TV. I want to be able to have a car. I want to be able to speak out. But the thing I heard over and over again is we want the right to vote. And I'm just a young guy, and I'm not quite getting that. And I'm asking them, well, why voting? And they said, look, if we cannot decide who our leaders are, and once we decide, we cannot hold them accountable, if we can't vote them out of office when they do what we don't like, we have no freedom. All of these other freedoms, freedom of speech, privacy, religion, can all be taken away from us. So for me, voting is super important. So when the voter ID law was passed here in March, it was something personal. And we were, of course, going to take it on. And I was thrilled, because litigation is a wonderful thing. Right? Because people can stand up and say, oh, we got to do this because there's voter fraud. We got to do this because there's all these problems. And they can't be held accountable. Sort of like Mitt Romney the other night would say whatever he wanted without regard for the truth. Well, in litigation, you can force them to answer the question. You can prove what's right, and you can prove what's wrong. And I heard all of the critics saying that this is really about voter suppression. This is really about partisan advantage. But I like to see the good in people. I think people are basically good. And I sort of suspended my thinking. Maybe there really is something. Maybe they really were thinking that there's a good reason to have this voter ID. So I was not prepared to say that this is about voter suppression. And then we get into the litigation, and through a series of revelations over the course of the last 6 months, which damn near kicked my ass, I can tell you that, one by one, my feelings began to change. So it started with only 100,000 people don't have ID. It was kind of hard to believe. And then we're already in the lawsuit, we're starting to press them for numbers, and on July the 3rd at 3:30 in the afternoon, it's like a Wednesday, 3:30 in the afternoon, everybody's gone home. 4th of July is some big holiday. They issue a press release saying the majority of voters have photo ID. It's a great thing. And when you get down to the 4th paragraph, it says, yep, 91% of the people have photo ID. That means 9% don't. When you do the math, that's like 759,000 people. Whoops, that's a lot more than 100,000. Well, maybe there is something to this voter suppression. And then they kept saying, you know what, we got all these examples of impersonation voter fraud. So the first thing we do is we say, all right, show us all the examples. We send them something called an interrogatory. They got a list, every single example of impersonation voter fraud. And they came back and they had 9 examples. Okay, but none of them were impersonation voter fraud. What you gotta understand is that there is fraud in elections. There is definitely fraud in elections. I mean, we got a state senator from here who just went to jail for election-related fraud. We got a Supreme Court justice who's been indicted for election-related fraud. But what you need to understand is that photo ID only prevents one kind of fraud. And that's the kind of fraud where I show up at the polls and pretend to be somebody else. Impersonation voter fraud. That's the only kind of fraud that photo ID takes care of. And do you know how often that has happened in Pennsylvania in the last 10 years? Zero. So on the eve of the trial, the Commonwealth signed something called stipulation, and in that stipulation they say, we are not aware of a single prosecution for impersonation voter fraud. We are not aware of even a single instance of impersonation voter fraud, and even if this law is blocked, we don't believe it's going to increase the likelihood of impersonation voter fraud. And I'm like, why are we here? Why do we have this law? And I'm thinking, well, maybe there's something to that. Voter suppression. And then we're out there looking for people who might be affected by this law. Because they say, come on, show us. You know, we've been saying, show us the people who have been defrauded. And they couldn't do that. And they're saying, well, show us people who can't get ID. And we come up with hundreds of people. People like Vivian Applewhite, who is 93 years old, has voted in every single election since 1940. Every single presidential election since then. She marched with Dr. King for voting rights. She used to go to his church when she went down to visit there. But she lost her purse about 10 years ago. And while the vast majority of people do have photo ID, if you got 10% of the people who don't, that's still an awful lot of people. And who are the people who don't have photo ID? It's people who don't drive, it's people who don't fly, it's people who are largely poor, who are uneducated, who are very young, who are very old. And we started showing these folks, and the Commonwealth keeps saying, no, everybody can get ID. And then we get a memo. We get a memo written by the General Counsel from the Department of State. So litigation's a wonderful thing. And in this memo, they say, you know, we got a problem. There's all these people who really can't get a PennDOT photo ID. People who can't get a birth certificate. Black people born in Jim Crow South because they never recorded their birth. Those folks can't get ID. We got a problem. We got to make a change. So they make a change on the eve of our trial. We're ready to attack the system they got. We're ready to show that this system is corrupt. It's all about voter suppression. There's no reason to have it. What do they say? We got a whole new system. We got a new ID. Everybody's going to be able to walk into PennDOT in 5 minutes and get that ID. So what they say is you don't need the documents. You don't need a birth certificate anymore. So what do? We put people on the stand. A woman named B. Butler, who's 94, I tell you, I dealt with more elderly senior citizens, wonderful, tremendous people in this case. It was terrific. She's in a nursing home. She votes in the nursing home. I mean, she can't vote absentee, right? She only leaves her nursing home like twice a year, and that's just to go next door. She could not get 6 miles to the DMV, and she testified via videotape in court. And you could see her, she's shaking, she's hemming and hawing, but she says voting is so important. I gotta vote, I'm gonna vote, but I can't get to the PennDOT. And we presented another young man, an autistic young man named Taylor Floria, 19 years old. We had to bring him in the night before and put him up in a hotel because he just could not travel in one day. And he got on the stand to testify. And he had this very halting speech, but it was beautiful. He was articulate. And he talked about how his mother drove him to the DMV. It was 35 minutes away. He lived in Chester County. And that he got there And within 10 minutes, because of all the stimuli in there, he started to shut down. And he couldn't speak, which is what happens. And they had to leave. And he couldn't complete the process. And then his mother took the stand, because we had no idea how well this young man was going to do with his disability. And he was tremendous. We really didn't have to put his mother on the stand. We put the mother on the stand to confirm what he said. And Taylor's sitting next to me. And while his mother's testifying, within about 2 minutes, he starts digging his arm into his armpit. And I put my hand on his shoulder. And I say, Taylor, are you okay? We have a quiet room in the back. Do you want to go in the back and be quiet? You could tell he was in distress. And he pulls his arm out and he looks at me and he says, no, I have to be here from my mother. And what does the Commonwealth argue? The Commonwealth argues we don't believe that B. Bookler or Taylor Floria aren't going to be able to vote. And even if they have to vote provisionally, they can go to, and it doesn't count, they can go to common pleas court after the election. So here's two people who just testified that they tried and cannot get to a DMV, which is where you have to go. It's the only place you can go to get that ID. And the Commonwealth says, well, they can go to court. If they can't go to DMV, they can't go to court and get a lawyer. And I started to think, well, maybe there is something about this voter suppression. And then, you know what? Any fair-minded person who would have looked at all of this evidence, that there is absolutely no justification for this law, that you are looking at close to 1 million people who don't have this kind of ID. You've got all of these individuals who are not going to be able to vote, people who have voted their entire lives. And any fair-minded person, any fair-minded judge could look at this information and come to only one conclusion. But you know what? We lost. We lost. And I'm thinking, well, maybe it's not voter suppression. And then you have that, what's that guy's name? Turzai. You got Turzai. Wow. Talk about a little honesty. I'm thinking, well, you know what? Maybe it is a little bit of voter suppression. And then the Supreme Court gave us a lease on life. And all 6 justices had a problem with what the judge did. They did it in different ways. It was a little odd. It wasn't the most direct thing to do. It wasn't necessarily the best thing to do. But the key is all 6 of those justices had a problem with what that judge did. And they sent it back in. And we raced, and in the space of 1 week, we went back to trial. And we were in trial for 2 days last week. And the Commonwealth came in and said, yeah, there's been problems. We put on all these folks who were told that we're not given free ID anymore. People who went and waited in line for 3-4 hours only to be told that you have the wrong kind of social security card. You had people who had to make 3, 4, 5 trips, people who couldn't get there at all, people who went and the person who processes the ID wasn't there. I mean, it was a mess. And the Commonwealth comes in and says, but wait, we're changing the process and it's going to be easier. It's going to be better. And we assure you that everybody can get ID. And then their lawyers get up and they argue 2 things. One is, voting is not a fundamental right.
Wow. Whoa. Wow.
What country are they living in? And then they get up and say, just because somebody isn't allowed to vote doesn't mean it's disenfranchisement. If the ID is theoretically available, just because they don't go and get that ID, doesn't mean it's disenfranchisement. They're lazy. And I looked at our clients. I looked at all of these courageous people who had marched into that court. The courageous people who, when we first met, said, would you maybe be willing to talk to the media? Would you be willing to go on with the Reverend Al Sharpton? That would be too much. And they sucked it up, and they got on TV, and they got on the radio, and they got in the newspapers, and they told their story, and they showed the people of this state and the people of this country that they're getting a raw deal, and that their right to vote is being taken away. And when I heard the Commonwealth get up there and argue that voting's not a fundamental right, that people aren't going to be disenfranchised just because they can't vote, you know what I said? This is about voter suppression. This is about partisan advantage. And we cannot let that happen, because this is America, and we're better than that. And I just need to make one disclaimer here, that this really is just about the right to vote and not who you vote for. We did not ask a single person what party they were registered with. We did not ask a single person who they were going to vote for. I gotta tell you, an awful lot of the folks just couldn't wait to get on the witness stand and say, I'm voting for Barack. That's their right, that's free speech. But this is really about the right to vote. And unless every eligible elector in this state has the opportunity to go into that polling place and vote on that electronic voting machine, then this country is going down the tubes, and we're not going to let that happen. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for your support.